Jai Baba, one and all. Welcome to this, the sixth session in our online series on the subject of Meher Baba. God speaks as the master framework for Meher Baba's Darshana. This session is going to be on the topic of the evolution of consciousness. And this slide gives a little description more about what it's going to be here. Creation and the evolution of consciousness. We actually began this part in the last presentation where we talked about creation and the whim of God. But now we're going on to evolution, the total topic. The whim of God and the urge towards self-knowledge, the evolutionary descent and the gathering of consciousness through the acquisition of sanskaras, the seven kingdoms of evolution. So that latter part is going to be our topic today. The system and the pattern that we have devised, as this slide might help you to see, we have weekly presentations on topics, a series of topics, and then on Sundays we have live discussions through through Google Meet, it's called. You can find the previous videos, all of them up until now, on, as the slide says, youtube.com/Mehrabad. And to access the link for the Sunday session, you can do it through, as is given here, https://meet.google.com/bar-vwdo-yof. Anyone is free to join in and just listen or take part as you like. That's 4 o'clock India time. So if you're in California, that's extremely convenient for you. It's 3:30 in the morning when I know you're all up praying to Baba. In Australia, I think it might be 8:30 p.m. So 4 o'clock p.m. on Sundays. Okay, so the main focus in God Speaks today is part 2. That's the second chapter. I have, as this slide shows you the first page of it. It's entitled The Initial Urge and the Journey of Evolving Consciousness. Actually, in the last session, I talked about the whim of God, the primal urge, God's question to know himself. That is the topic of these first 2 pages, as you can see on the slide. But scrolling through the rest of the chapter here, pages 12, 13, 14, and so forth, up to here, page 27, this is all on the evolution of consciousness. And in fact, the next chapter, as you can see here, part 3, characteristics of the different kingdoms, a short chapter, just 3 pages, as you can see. Okay, so that chapter is also on evolution. So chapters 2 and 3 are on evolution. In an earlier session, the third session, as this slide illustrates visually, we talked about the subject of the divine theme. I'm going to keep coming back to this so to help us keep track of where we are. So this slide of Rano Gailey's drawing depicting the divine theme is one that we'll keep referring to throughout this series because it's so useful. As you can see here, the journey begins in the beyond state of God, and the next stage is evolution, as the laser pointer is showing, through the different kingdoms of evolution. They're first gaseous forms, then stone, metal, vegetable, worm, I can't quite read those. What is that saying? Something, reptile, worm, insect, reptile, fish, bird, animal until human form. Those are the kingdoms of evolution. And you can see with this twisted line here, twisting line, what that signifies is the winding up of sanskaras. Through the course of evolution, sanskaras are winding and accumulating, and they help to capture consciousness. That's the stage that we're talking about today. That's the phase of the divine theme. That's the subject, the evolution of consciousness. And Baba has a perspective on it, on evolution, that is very worth noting. It's right on this page 23. You can there's an important statement right at the top of page 23. By the way, when I refer to God Speaks, I'm always referring to the second edition, the third printing. So if your pages aren't corresponding, that's because you have a earlier printing. The third printing, they re-flowed the text and page number's different. The Indian edition, for any of you using that, is this. It's the same edition. So reading the top lines there, directly and indirectly, these associations and dissociations of the consciousness of the soul are absolutely essential to keep the wheel of evolution of consciousness revolving. And now here's the sentence I really, I tried to expand and put on my laser and lost it, so I can't use the laser, but the last sentence there. The evolution of gross forms is but a byproduct in the universal factory of evolution of consciousness. Let me read that again because it's quite important. The evolution of gross forms is but a byproduct in the universal factory of evolution of consciousness. Okay, so the point there is that what drives evolution is the evolution of consciousness. It is not the evolution of form that drives, in the driver's seat here, it's the evolution of consciousness. So this is a fundamental characteristic of Baba's account of evolution. Now, let me just mention in brief here a very significant background to Baba's account of evolution. When we were talking earlier about the drop in the ocean, how the Atma, the drop soul, is really one and the same with the ocean or the Paramatma, this has a lot of relationship with a great school in the Hindu world called Advaita Vedanta. When we come to evolution, really a significant background is the evolution of the development of science in the last 500 years. That's where this topic has really been brought up in a major way. The scientific revolution in Europe really began around 1500 with Copernicus and Kepler and Galileo, and then Sir Isaac Newton, these great, scientific geniuses. And in the 19th century, the topic of evolution really arose. And the great name associated with it, as many of you will already know, is Charles Darwin, who wrote a book called The Origin of the Species, published in 1959. And that still remains in a updated form, orthodoxy within much of the scientific world. It's called Neo-Darwinism. And I'm going to just say a little bit about this because this issue has to come up within the Meher Baba world sooner or later. The philosophical presuppositions of Neo-Darwinism and of Meher Baba are really not the same. They're quite the reverse of each other. That is to say, Meher Baba's account of evolution accords reality and priority and the driving role to consciousness. Consciousness evolves and form arises to serve the needs of consciousness. And that is not at all the perspective of philosophical materialism, it's called, which has come to prevail in many quarters of modern civilization and modern science. Philosophical materialism holds that the only things that are real are matter and energy. So sooner or later, this debate is going to have to arise. So I'm just going to say one or two little things about this. People may agree or disagree. I'm not an evolutionary scientist, but my father was a molecular biologist, world reputation. He ran a laboratory, so I grew up with this stuff. And I've taken a lot of interest in the last 10 years. And there are many people saying now that the idea that scientific discovery discredits belief in God is based on an old-fashioned model of science, 19th century science. And contemporary science, physics too, has really opened the question up again. For example, now it is widely held that the universe arose out of nothing 13.8 billion years ago. There were some very famous physicists who are quite outraged because this seemed to confirm the book of Genesis in the Bible, which they were not prepared to swallow very well. And even now, when one studies the material world, 130 years ago, science would have held that that matter is comprised of little corpuscular units of atoms, that solid foundation of the material world. That is completely gone now. Any of you who have looked into like quantum science will know that the material world is like a probabilities wave function cloud that only attains particular location when it's measured and all of that. So the scientific foundations of materialism are changing enormously. And if I may say this, that's happening with Darwinism also. There are many people within that. It's not said publicly very much, but people within that field have come to see that the probabilities of life having arisen in the Darwinian manner through random mutation is wildly unlikely. Now that they've actually cracked the genetic code and can calculate the statistical probability of DNA creating proteins, the world would have to be a trillion times older than it is for any such thing to have arisen. So I'm not going to go into this. There might be many people who have many things to say on it. But the reason I'm saying it is this, that if the time comes where people from philosophical materialism come to Baba lovers and say, your master doesn't know the first thing about evolution, he's a fool. Well, that does not impress me. And I think that within 50 years or so, biological science and the theory of evolution will have changed completely, because they're going to have to deal with some of these new things that are coming into view. So that's just a little bit on the topic of science. Here's just for the interest of it, a little comment. Baba would comment on Darwinism, Darwin from time to time. And, let's just check, because I have the wrong. Yeah, here we go. Baba would comment on Darwinism from time to time, and here's one of his little comments. He's talking about actually what happens after Mahapralaya. The intellectual conviction that I impart to the world, this is Baba speaking, will be transmitted in this very way, that is, from one who is superior, from one who understands, to men who are inferior and who do not understand. In other words, when the God-man speaks, it's from a position of true knowledge. In addition, these intellectual convictions will be accompanied by proofs. Darwin, when he propounded the theory of evolution, based his intellectual convictions merely on science, scientific research, scientific knowledge. He never thought or even dreamt that God's hand might be involved in the process. Of course, then in Baba's account, God's hand it's not just God's hand. God is actually the very Atma that is undergoing this process. Okay, now here's Meher Baba's own account of evolution. As we were talking about before, his divine theme has 5 stages: creation, evolution, reincarnation, involution, and realization of God. We're in evolution right now. And in Baba's account, form and consciousness evolve concurrently. That is to say, that consciousness develops through experience. By having new experiences, new sanskaras are acquired and consciousness grows. Therefore, when the soul discards a physical form, it needs a more developed physical form to be adequate to its new consciousness, and thus it leapfrogs, it does an upward step into a higher form. So the two are evolving concurrently, with the needs of consciousness being fulfilled by an ever advancing series of forms. Now Baba develops his account of evolution in a number of places, and let me give you some of the places to go to if you want to go further with this. There are many places, but I'll just mention some of the most important. One of them is this very section we're on, chapters 2 and 3 in God Speaks. Chapter 8, when Baba comes back to the divine theme a second time, he returns to evolution, but he does it in a completely different way, so you won't really find out much about evolution there. But in chapter 9, part 9, the 10 states of God, that section on the 5th state of God is on evolution, and it's very significant and helpful also. Here are some earlier discourses Baba gave that turn out to be significant. One of them is from a series of talks Baba gave in 1927, actually, and this book will be published very soon. It's called Creation and Its Causes. Baba was talking on Mehrabad Hill to the boys of the Meher Ashram. Baba was in seclusion in his the crypt cabin, which is now the Samadhi at the time. And particularly on December 18th, 1927, Baba gave a very significant account of evolution. And the reason why I call it significant is that appears to be the basis for later published versions that appeared first in the Meher Message, then in a book by Ramju, and then in the Meher Baba Journal. All of that is going to be published in an critical edition before very long. So the source dictation appears to have been Baba's account before the Meher Ashram boys. Some of that is recapitulated. By the way, some of that material actually found its way into God Speaks in the chapter, The 10 States of God. So that particular series of dictations was a very important one. And there's another important body of material, and let me just show you some of the images from the book. Here is the first page, okay, the descending track of evolution. And then let's see, here we go. Oops. The evolution of atom, stone, and mineral. And then you're going to have in the next short chapter the evolution of vegetation. And then in the next chapter, the evolution of animals. And then, and here you see on this page, two exotic animals that Baba described, and that I think that someone did drawings of. That fish reptile on the left is 300 feet long, Baba said, and had 3 heads. And the bat bird on the right is 15 feet tall and would run at 70 miles an hour. These are creatures, Baba said, that existed formerly. At the very end of this account, you can see, monkeys, bushmen, cannibals, and thus the emergence of human beings in the course of the story. All of this that I've just been showing you is from material that Baba prepared in 1934 in preparation for a visit to Hollywood, where he wanted a movie made, and it was going to be called How It All Happened. So Baba, here at Mehrabad, down at the, I think the Dharamshala, what's now the old Dharamshala, sat with some of the Mandali and prepared all of this material, and has a lot on evolution. So this is another place that's really worth going to. But now coming to this chapter in God Speaks, this, sometimes people, when they talk about God Speaks, will talk, oh, it's impossible. There's the most, next, and the first most, and the next most, and this kind of strange language. Well, this is actually the chapter that they're referring to, where this kind of language comes up. And after the first 2 pages on the subject of creation, Baba starts getting into this process. Let me read a little bit of this to illustrate the kind of language. So he's talking about the evolution from stone onward. Let me make sure I have the right page here. Just 1 second. I want to 5. Yeah, no, that's not the right page. Okay, so Baba has had described the identification of the drop soul with stone form, the first most stone form. And now he goes on, as you can see here, after ages and cycles, page 12 we're on, the most finite gross consciousness is gradually much more evolved in the soul by innumerable and varied experiences of the most gross finite impressions through the identification of the soul with the first most species of stone, right? So after ages of being that form, its impressions, its experiences have given it new impressions. Eventually, when a limit to having experiences is reached, the identification of the soul with the first most species of stone is gradually dissociated, and that stone form is dropped. So when the form has reached the limit of what the soul can experience through that form, the form gets dropped, right? The forms have limited capacities, and at a certain point they can't serve the needs of the soul anymore. The soul, now, this is what happens after the body is dropped. The soul remains now for a period without any medium, though the most finite consciousness, which has been evolved, remains together with the most gross finite impressions of the most first species of stone form just shed. You got all of that? So even though it's dropped that form, the sanskaras remain in association with the gathered consciousness, even though there's no body now. This is between forms when you've just dropped your stone form. And the sanskaras are still there. Thus, the soul, now, without any medium or form, is conscious of the most finite impressions, sanskaras. But as long as consciousness is centered in impressions, the soul must necessarily experience those impressions. So one of the characteristics of sanskaras is that when you have them, you have to experience them. They have a compulsive power. You cannot be free until you've experienced them. So the soul doesn't have a body right now, but it has sanskaras, and these sanskaras have to be spent. Therefore, in order to experience the impressions of the most first species of stone form dropped, the consciousness of the soul, centered in the impressions of the dropped stone form, begins to associate with the most next species of stone form. Get most next, you move the infinitesimal shift of species. The soul identifies itself with this species of stone, and the consciousness of the soul begins to experience, through association with the new medium, of the most next species of stone form, the impressions of the most first species of stone form. Now, this is a bit difficult perhaps, but here's what Baba is saying, and this is quite a significant principle. When you go on to the next species of stone form, what you're actually experiencing is the sanskaras you acquired in the previous form. But those have created the mold for the new form, but you're experiencing your last lifetime. This is true throughout. So all of us, or there's a group of here sitting in this room in Mirabad, and all of you who may be watching wherever you are, you're actually living out the sanskaras of your previous lifetime. It is a universal principle. And when we get to chapter 8, the very long chapter, Baba will enunciate what I feel is the universal principle underlying that, which is that we're all living in the past. We don't live in the present. The past keeps coming up through sanskaras. The sanskaras are memories of the past. They present the past, which we believe to be the present, but it's not. It's actually the past. And we live it out as if it is the present, and in the course of doing so, create new sanskaras. And those go into our unconscious mind. And the next lifetime, they come up, and they're the previous life, and we think they're the present again. This process of always experiencing the past begins right here, where the very first form you have as stone serves as the medium for the accumulation of sanskaras that create your next form, where you live out the sanskaras you created the form before. In fact, this is even true of the avatar, Baba once said. He said, in this advent as Meher Baba, I'm living out the incarnation of Muhammad. Mm-hmm. So apparently, even with the avatar, this is true. So I read just a little bit of this description of stone form, from the most first stone form to the next. If you read through this whole chapter, Baba goes through this process again and again and again. It's highly repetitive. And some people might ask the question, why does Baba have to repeat this so many times? And this is what I think. For one thing, thick skulls like mine have to be hammered a lot before ideas penetrate. That's one thing. It really is worth it to be patient and read it through, and even read it aloud. I think that's a good idea, to begin to get the pattern. But here's something else I'd like to suggest. I somehow imagine Baba dictating this to Erich when he's talking. And this is the avatar of the age, who not only has direct knowledge of this happening, but experiences himself as that stone. And the slow, tortuous, infinitesimal progress from one little stone form to the next. Well, the avatar is that. And he experiences, who is the soul? It's Almighty God. Limitless, formless, and the poor thing thinks it's a stone. And it's going through this tortuous, slow progress of consciousness. So I think when Meher Baba was dictating this, he was describing what he not only saw, but what he was. So these four grounds for the differences in the experience in souls are what make possible this evolutionary process that Baba was describing here. And I just want to remind you, for those who might have seen the previous session, of this chart, chart 7, where we here, to go to the center left there, you read this chart like a grammatical sentence. Man is gross conscious through gross body equals the small gross shadow of, that is, man is gross conscious through the body of the gross sphere equals big gross shadow equals gross nothing into nothing, gross nothing equals nothing into nothing into nothing. Baba is describing experience. We're through the medium of a gross body, which is a shadow of the soul, you experience the world around you, like the room you see or wherever you may be. This is the shadow of the oversoul. So this is the process that he's starting to describe in his account of evolution, how the soul identifies, has these sanskaras which compel it to identify with a new medium suitable to its consciousness at the time. And through that medium, those old sanskaras arise and provide the basis for a new experience, which is registered and recorded in the form of new sanskaras. And because the consciousness is continuing to accumulate, sanskaras are the hero of the story at this stage, because it's through them that your consciousness grows. But because you've accumulated more and more sanskaras, you need a more developed and complex body. Thus, the impetus, and under all of this is the whim of God, talked about in the previous one, which says, who am I? Who am I? Who am I? Driving, driving, driving. So the consciousness continues to accumulate, and the form continues to become more developed and pass through all kinds of new experiences. That's how evolution occurs. And now in this first chapter, I won't pull up the passages, but there are several times where Baba stops and makes the comment, all of this is happening because the soul needs eventually to become free of all of sanskaras so that it can experience itself. It's purposeful. All of this is a purposeful process. So here are some of the general themes. I'm going to be coming into the kingdoms of evolution in a minute, but to look at some of the important themes, again, it's always to be remembered that the evolution of form is a byproduct of the evolution of consciousness. Consciousness needs new form, needs new media of expression, and new forms arise to meet that need. In each new form, you're living out, or the Atma, the soul, is living out the impressions that it acquired in the previous form. You're always living out your past lifetime. This is even true in human form. And this theme is reflected throughout God Speaks. I've noticed, even in the presentation of different topics, like at the beginning in the chapter on reincarnation, he starts that chapter with a long digression back into the evolution of consciousness. Reincarnation is about reincarnation in human form, but he introduces it by going back to where it came from. This is a pattern in God Speaks. Baba, keep your eyes open and perhaps you'll see it. He'll often introduce a topic and then tell you where it came from to get to be there. I don't find this in other books of Baba's. It's a distinctive characteristic of this book in particular. Also, this is a very important point which he brings up in this first chapter. And I'm actually going to pull this up and read it for a sec. Yeah, this is page 23. Again, the consciousness, the conscious soul experiences itself as being without any form. It's just dropped another form and experiences itself as being without a form for the time, although the consciousness evolved further and greater is always there. Now this is the sentence I want you to notice. Once consciousness is achieved by the soul, this consciousness goes on evolving more and more and can never be lost or devolved. Do you get that? Consciousness, once acquired, can never be lost. That's a basic principle here. Okay, here's another important aspect and theme of Meher Baba's evolutionary account that's really worth noting, and that is that evolution comes to an end with the human form. And this is a statement of that. And God Speaks for page 26, right at the bottom, as you can see in the slide. As soon as the consciousness of the soul associates with the most first human form, the evolution of consciousness is full and complete. Because the consciousness of the soul is fully developed in human form, the evolution of form is also complete, and no new higher forms are now evolved once the conscious soul identifies itself with the most first human form. You get that? There's no form beyond the human. This is a aspect of Meher Baba's account of evolution that this understanding is not there in science. Science thinks evolution will go on forever. But in Baba's account, its purpose has been fulfilled and it is finished. Now further progress is inward, not in the evolution of form. The process of the evolution, continuing in 27 here, the process of the evolution of consciousness is brought to a standstill. The human form is the highest and the most sublime form evolved during the evolution of consciousness. Hence, in the human being, consciousness is fully developed and the form molded and cast after ages and cycles is the most perfect form or medium. Okay, so that's a really important part of Baba's evolutionary account. Now, there's another part of Baba's evolutionary, another aspect of it to be noted, and that is that there are different kingdoms of evolution, and this slide 4 shows them. You can see the evolutionary descent is on the left, and the involutionary ascent is on the right? First plane, second plane, third plane, etc. That's involution. And evolution is on the left. Stones and metals, vegetation, worms, fishes, birds, animals, man. And by the way, in the structure of this chart, if you'll notice, down at the bottom left there with man, the lines look like a 7, right? Can you see the 7 written there? If you go up on the other side, the lines there in red make it for a 7 also. So it seems that the number 7 is fundamental to this whole process. There is a numerological aspect and element in Meher Baba's Darshana, and that turns out to be important. So I'm going to bring up some complicating factors here. Okay, before I do that, let me, in this chapter 2 of God Speaks, and you can see it on this slide. This would be page 28, part 3. Here we have characteristics of the different kingdoms. And we have the kingdom of stones and kingdom of metals, then characteristics of the vegetable kingdom, characteristic of the kingdom of worms. And Baba did explain that by worms he meant to encompass their worms, insects, amphibians, and reptiles, all of those. And in the course of describing that in the previous chapter, he would give some of the significant characteristics of that particular form. And this chapter effectively collects them. And I've created my own slide which summarizes some of those. That's this slide here. Kingdoms of evolution and their characteristics. So I'm going to read through these. Stone and metal, they're inanimate, right? They don't have voluntary motion. Life and energy are dormant. They are in a recumbent, lying down position. Now, a contribution of Baba to the understanding of this is that they are conscious. There is consciousness there, but it's very slight. One place he used the word near Chaitanya, almost none at all. Almost no Chaitanya at all. Now, with vegetable form, let me go back. In vegetable form, vegetative plants, it's half animate and half inanimate. See, plants do move a little bit. They open their leaves, they grow, they burp in flowers, but they don't walk around. They're dependent on things around them to stand upright. Whereas, animals and people and so forth can move independently of that. Now, here's an important characteristic. You won't see this explained in God Speaks exactly, but it's elsewhere. They stand erect with their head down and their feet up. For a tree or a plant, their head is under the ground and their feet are reaching up towards the sunlight. They're dependent on others for an erect position. I don't think God Speaks properly explains that they're upside down, but you will find it elsewhere. Worm form includes worms, insects, amphibians, and reptiles. They're animate, capable of voluntary motion, with a tendency to crawl. As we'll explain in a minute, the posture that the soul assumes in evolution is very important, it turns out. So they tend to crawl, never assuming erect posture. First, they're invertebrate, and then vertebrate, right? Vertebrate means a spinal column. So first without, then with. And in worm form, you start to experience the struggle for life. Now, with plants, that may actually be there, but they don't consciously experience that as such. But in worm forms, they do. Frogs and, ants and so forth. Fish, they're immersed in water, animate and vertebrate, right? There's a whole spinal column for fish. If ever you've eaten one, you have to take the bones out if you eat the whole thing. Endowed with life and sensation, experiencing the struggle for existence, and they're recumbent. They're more or less horizontal, although not entirely so. Elsewhere, Baba says they're up at about a 30-degree angle. Birds, associated with air and capable of flight. With the aid of two legs, they maintain an erect posture. They can start to stand up now. Animal, and by animal, Baba really seems to have meant mammals, actually. They have an expanded consciousness with life and sensation, sometimes herbivorous and sometimes carnivorous, right? Sometimes they're vegetarians and sometimes meat eaters, with a tendency to look downward with a drooping head. And at the end of this process, you have the human form. Full consciousness is there, and in human form, you assert an upright posture. The whole of evolution has been to stand upright. Now, there are some questions that are going to come up if you study this topic closely. So I'll just give you a little indication of it. I showed you this slide earlier, chart 4 in God Speaks. Well, let me just see if you can notice the difference. Stones and metals, vegetation, worms, fishes, birds, animals, man, right? Okay, let's look at the previous first edition. Stones, metals, vegetation, worms, birds, animals, man. You notice the difference? There ain't no fish. And also, stones and metals are separate kingdoms, whereas here they are one single kingdom. Well, this kind of issue keeps coming up in the different versions of evolution. Like, let me show you in How It All Happened, where Baba presented this stuff also. This is that master chart Baba created when he went to Hollywood. I don't know if you can quite see this, but here you see the evolution of form and consciousness. Form is on the right, center right, and consciousness is on the left. They're evolving concurrently. So here are the kingdoms: stone, metals, vegetables, fishes, reptiles, mammals, and human. Well, there are no birds, and reptiles are worms. They should be before fishes. So there are a lot of kind of inconsistencies you'll find in these charts. I've written there in Creation and Its Causes, there's a whole appendix on evolution that deals with all of these questions in some detail. A lot of this comes from the fact that in the dictation Baba gave in 1927, it seems to have been garbled in the recording of it. Baba was illustrating this with a cloth doll, and I don't think they got the notes down right. And there doesn't seem to have been anyone among the Mandali interested in evolutionary biology to raise the question again. But here is what I'll just suggest, tender this idea before moving on. This is what I take to be at the core of it. Very fundamental is the number 7. And in another treatment, we could explore this a lot more. There's a primal vibration early in the creation process that has 7 reverberations and 7 divisions of Pran and so forth. It seems to me that what is most essential about these kingdoms of evolution is the number 7, and I actually think that this resolves it, to my mind, right at the start, that it's actually not 7 kingdoms, it's 7 leaps. It's 7 movements. It's not nouns, it's verbs. And this is where he says something like this: to achieve a complete development of consciousness in the human form, the evolutionary process had to take 7 major leaps, viz., from stone to metal, from metal to vegetable, from vegetable to worm, from worm to fish, from fish to bird, from bird to animal, and finally from animal to the human being. So that, in my opinion, is what is really at the core of all of this. There are 7 fundamental movements that result in different kingdoms of evolution. So I'm just alerting you to these kinds of issues. If you ever start to explore this more widely, you're bound to bump into this. And here is the last point I want to bring up about evolution, and it's actually a very important one. In fact, let me show this slide here from this forthcoming book, Creation and Its Causes, which gives a visual illustration of it. Baba said a very remarkable thing, that all forms in creation are the human form. There is only one form in creation, and it's the human form. But in earlier kingdoms, it's all compacted and folded in on itself. Baba said He was saying this from as early as the 1920s, and he says it in God Speaks also, that a stone has a nose, a mouth, ears, eyes, arms, all of this, but they're so folded in on themselves that you can't see them. But in the course of evolution, the human form unfolds and manifests itself gradually, a bit at a time. So when you go from metal to a plant, well, now the mouth is there in the form of roots, and it's sucking water from the ground, and its hands and feet are up in the air. And you can see these various, human features in other animals, scorpions or snakes or so forth. They'll have all these things. That's the human form trying to find its perfect form, which it does in us, actually. And in this process, you won't find this in the second chapter in God Speaks, but you will in the 10 States of God chapter, in the 5th state of God. The human form goes through 5 turns. And what turns means is that the human form wants to stand up, upright, vertical. It wants to assert an upright, vertical posture. And the first turn is from stone to plant, or metal to plant, and it achieves a vertical posture, but it's upside down. So its head is under the ground and its feet are up in the air. And then in worm, it's prostrate, and then gradually through the other kingdoms, it starts to raise its head. Actually, if we need to get a good yogi, because there's a particular series of movements that may illustrate what happens. I think first its rump goes up, and then it goes up like this. And finally, in the animal form, the mammal forms, it starts to stand upright and assert its upright, erect posture with its head, like this. And that's why stand tall. Well, it took the entire evolutionary process to do that. And in human form, the entire goal of evolution is achieved, and the perfect form has been achieved. This is all that the consciousness needs now to realize the goal of finding itself. So this chart here, this figure from creation and its causes, we just, Nadia drew this, and we worked on this a lot. It tries to illustrate the human form going through different postures as it goes from stone in the top right to human form on the top left. And when Baba explained this to the Bear Ashram boys in 1927, this seems to be the only time he properly explained it. He had a cloth doll with him, and he manipulated it and moved it to show these different postures. But these stupid Mandalay didn't bring a video camera, so they didn't record it properly. So all the versions of this are a bit garbled and confused. But the basic process you can understand. And this is the very last point to make about evolution. And you don't really find this in God Speaks, but in this slide here, again from Creation and Its Causes, it illustrates it. Through the course of evolution, if you can see this, do I have a laser, or was that going to shrink the slide? Okay, down on the bottom right quadrant here, you have, stone, metal, vegetable, worm. These forms are predominantly associated with the element of earth. In fish form, the Atma, the consciousness of the Atma, that's down in the bottom left quadrant, becomes associated with the element of water. In bird form, the consciousness becomes associated with air, right? Earth, water, air. And in animal form, it becomes associated with fire. And what Baba means by this is that driving fire to eat, to excrete, to have sex, all these gross urges, and animals like are constantly wanting to eat. It's because fire predominates in them. But in the human form, which is right at the center here, we have all four of those elements blended, finally. So that is a short account of Meher Baba's explanation of evolution. And next time we'll go on to chapter 4, part 4, on reincarnation, the third stage in the divine theme. Having achieved human form, there's no need for higher form, there's no need for further consciousness, but you go round and round and round, recycling and recycling your sanskaras for 8,400,000 lives. Baba gives just one chapter to this in God Speaks, so that we'll spend just one session on it. But there are major, much more extended treatments elsewhere in his literature. Okay, thank you very much. And that's an Avatar Meher Baba Ki Jai.